In France, protesters took to the streets yesterday and some public sector workers stayed home in the first major demonstrations against President Macron's reform agenda. Macron and Prime Minister Edouard Philippe say they want to drive down France's high unemployment rate by giving greater freedom to employers to hire and fire workers and allowing local bargaining over pay and conditions. Yesterday's strike was smaller than others over the past year, but they come at a time when approval for the president has fallen to 30%. I'm joined by journalist and broadcaster Nabila Ramdani. Nabila, we know that labour reform, it's a sword, and in France indeed on which many political careers have perished. What are these reforms that the French president wants implemented and why?
Well, hello, Mary. Well, I think the first thing to say really is that, like all new presidents of France, Emmanuel Macron has a hugely ambitious agenda, and it's not just designed to sort out day-to-day problems, but to bring about widespread institutional changes so as to alter the nature of French society, really. He made that point forcefully to me when I interviewed him and during other events where he has spoken and that I was able to attend. And this kind of change has, of course, been promised for years, but never actually happens, mainly because France is an intensely conservative country with a small c, and whether people are socialists or far-right fascists, they don't really like change. And yesterday, there were the first big marches and strikes against Mr. Macron's employment reforms. In a nutshell, he wants to bring in a system that makes it easier to hire and fire and to employ new staff. The unions don't like this at all, and hence the demonstrations, which, as usual, got quite violent in cities like Paris. Macron's main target really is to reduce a jobless rate currently hovering at just below 10%, and in some parts of the country the figure can go as high as 40%, especially amongst young people. It is, of course, too early to say how Mr. Macron will succeed in his economic reforms. Remember that France is still a country where, people take the whole of August off and doesn't do much during the rest of the summer either. We're still in September, and so the autumn and winter are going to be absolutely crucial. But what you have to remember about Mr. Macron is that he's been incredibly lucky so far from day one. And even yesterday, he was able to slip off to the Caribbean to deal with Hurricane Irma relief rather than face up to the protesters in Paris.
Did he also stoke the fires of opposition when he used the word lazy?
Yes, indeed, but Mary, it's a strange atmosphere in France at the moment because on one side you've got a country that knows that reform is essential and that Emmanuel Macron came into office pledging that reform, and then on the other side lots of people are terribly scared of reform, and Mr. Macron said it himself a couple of weeks ago, the French hate reform. And I know many of your listeners would have visited France over many years, and one thing we can all say about it is that it doesn't change for good or bad, and that is the challenge. And Macron's immediate predecessors, Jacques Chirac, Nicolas Sarkozy, François Hollande, all failed and achieved nothing in terms of reform. So in many ways, what Macron is trying to do is he's trying to buck the trend, really.
What are the prospects for a deal? The French unions are powerful, but are they united here?
Well, surprisingly, only around 8% of the French workforce actually belongs to a union, but their influence is absolutely vital. And in France, it invariably translates into wide-scale disturbances that often deteriorate into major riots. And as you quite rightly pointed out, what Macron is effectively trying to do is trying to get staff representatives to negotiate directly with management of big companies, and so as to bypass the power of national unions, and that's what they're very angry about. But some of them actually are quite happy to engage in negotiations rather than take to the streets, and some unions, have called to keep their powder dry and perhaps take part in later demonstrations if they're not too happy about the way negotiations go. But I think it's fair to point out that there isn't an awful lot of antipathy towards Macron as a person, as opposed to, the kind of relationship the French had with previous presidents, such as the hugely divisive Nicolas Sarkozy or indeed François Hollande, whose presidency has been marked and marred by industrial strife. he comes across as a quite affable man.
Nonetheless, Nabila, his approval rating down to 30%. Can he buck the trend?
Well, I would certainly put that down to, a few mistakes he's made as far as his foreign policy is concerned. For example, he's proven to be a bit too reactionary on that front. But mainly, the months of the summer are famous for, boredom in France, and people tend to express their opposition to a newcomer, to any incumbent president. That's the pattern. But Macron is, rather than being a typical politician, he's more of a figure that's he comes across as more of a civil servant or a skilled technocrat, and I don't mean this as a criticism. I know, for example, that last night he slept in a gym in the Caribbean, and this is not, the kind of high living media public figure that you usually get in France.
Nabila Ramdani, thank you very much for joining us.